Good afternoon. My name is Hallie Potter, and I'm a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about enrollment preferences and equity in DC schools. This event is presented by the Century Foundation and DC Policy Center. I'm really excited for today's conversation. I began my career in education teaching at a public charter school in Washington, D.C. I now live in New York City, and in these pandemic times, I'm actually joining from my childhood bedroom while my parents watch my daughter. But D.C. remains near and dear to me, and the questions of educational equity are now ones that I think about as a former teacher, as a researcher, and as a parent. And I want to start by acknowledging that we are in a time for our country, for our schools, and for our families like no other. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated inequities that have long existed and that impact students' chances of academic success. These range from basic access to healthcare and food and stable housing to access to digital devices and internet connections. The nationwide protests for racial justice further drive home the unequal experiences that people of color and that Black people in particular face across all facets of society, including in our schools. We need to keep all of this in mind when we're thinking about what educational equity means in this time and what it means in DC, where 66% of public school students are Black and 19% are Latinx. Students' intersecting identities based on race, class, gender, sexuality, and immigration status, and their different access to healthcare, housing, and social emotional supports, all of this together needs to come to bear when we're thinking about what is needed to support children and families in these times. But today's conversation will zoom in to focus on one key aspect of educational equality, and that is who gets access to which schools. Even when we can't be together in physical school buildings, which school you go to, who your teachers are, who your principal is, that matters. And right now, about half of all public school students in district and charter schools in Washington, D.C. are considered at risk. The district defines that as students who are eligible for federal safety net programs, who are homeless or in the foster care system, or who are a year or more behind in school. These demographics, in combination with DC's unified school lottery system through the My School DC, in theory, create the conditions where you could have more district and charter schools in the city that can have a mixed enrollment, where you have some students who are at-risk students and a mix of non-at-risk peers. But the reality is that few individual schools actually reflect that overall economic diversity. And at-risk students in DC are much less likely to get access to a highly rated school. Only 25% of at-risk students attend a school with 4 or 5 stars on DC's STAR framework, compared to 58% of their non-at-risk peers. And in recent years, a majority of DC schools have become less economically diverse or have seen no change in their economic diversity. So there is a key question right now that is facing DC's education leaders, and that's whether an enrollment preference for at-risk students could increase equity and integration in DC schools. An at-risk preference was instituted for the first time in one of DC's district schools, the new Stevens Early Learning Center, and that happened last fall. Now, nationally, there's good precedent for preferences like that. The Century Foundation tracks these diversity preferences in admission, and we've identified more than 80 school districts across the country that currently consider students' socioeconomic status in school assignment decisions in order to promote integration. But charter schools in DC do not currently have the option of using an at-risk preference or any other diversity preference to promote integration. DC's public charter school law has been interpreted to prohibit preferences other than those specifically enumerated, which include preferences for siblings, children of the founding board or school employees, and in a few select schools for students with an IEP or disability. Those preferences do not include socioeconomic status, students' home languages or English proficiencies, or other educational risk factors. Last year at TCF, we conducted a review of charter policies in all 43 states plus DC that have charter schools. And we found that 2/3 of all states allow charter schools to implement at-risk preferences that could be used to encourage integration. They do this either by explicitly permitting these preferences or by staying silent on the issue. The District of Columbia is part of the minority, along with 14 states, in prohibiting the use of such lotteries. This morning, the DC Policy Center released exciting new research on the implications of implementing a preference for at-risk students in Washington, DC's Common Lottery, and what that preference could mean specifically for public charter schools in the city. So in just a minute, I'm going to turn things over to Chelsea Coffin, the Director of the Education Policy Initiative at the DC Policy Center and the author of this new research. She is going to present her findings, and after the presentation, Chelsea will lead a panel discussion with DC parents and educators and answer questions from the audience. So during the presentation, we will have our virtual moderators selecting questions for the Q&A. So anytime a question comes up, please type it in the Q&A chat box. If you have additional comments or any troubleshooting issues, you can put those in the Q&A chat box as well, and we'll do our best to address them. And finally, a recording of this webinar will be made available on our website immediately following the event. So with that, it's my great pleasure to hand things over to Chelsea Coffin from the DC Policy Center.
Great, thank you so much, Hallie. I'm so glad to be with you in this virtual setting, and thank you so much for everyone who took the time to join us today. I know, especially in DC, it's a busy day with the budget, so I'm really excited to be with you and share findings from our study on what an at-risk preference in the Common Lottery might mean for DC schools and students in terms of access and diversity at our schools. Can you go to the next slide? And next slide again. Great. So I will go through, as Hallie said, some slides to highlight the key findings from this report that we released this morning, and then we'll move to a panel discussion. And first of all, I just would like to set the stage, continue with a little bit more detail on what Hallie mentioned, and talk about a few reasons why an at-risk priority is important to consider in DC. And the first reason is that this has the potential to impact a large proportion of DC students. Around 45% of students are considered to be at risk for funding purposes in DC. The second reason is that socioeconomic diversity is low at some of our schools. This chart shows the distribution of schools, the number of schools, and the percent of at-risk students that they serve in different ranges. You can see that there are a lot of schools who serve between 50 and 70% of students who are at risk, which is a little bit higher than the city average. You also see that on the left, there are about 35 schools that serve 20% or less of students who are at risk. We think that these schools, given what we looked into for this report, would be the most likely to see a larger impact from an at-risk priority. And the third reason is that access to some highly rated schools can be a challenge for students who are at risk in DC for a few reasons. First, their location. Many highly rated schools that are in boundary DCPS schools tend to be located farther away from where most at-risk students live in DC. And the combination of high wait lists and sibling preference at some of these schools that are highly rated and serve low percentages of at-risk students can continue the demographics from year to year. Next slide, please. And so what did we look into for this report? We looked at 3 scenarios for implementing a priority for at-risk students in DC at a public charter school, and we compared these to the status quo. For those of you outside of DC, to give you some more context, about 3/4 of students in DC attend a school that is not their in-boundary school, a public charter school or a DCPS in-boundary school, but as an out-of-boundary student. And this means that many students use the Common Lottery to apply for spots at these schools. Families can rank up to 12 choices in the Common Lottery. And many schools have existing preferences for siblings of current students and children of staff. So we were interested to see 3 scenarios for how this at-risk preference might interact with current preferences. The first would be whether when an at-risk preference is implemented before siblings and children of current staff, if an at-risk preference is implemented after siblings and current and children of staff. And the third scenario is what would happen if a percentage of seats were reserved for at-risk students. We looked at 30% as a benchmark, just to give an idea of what that would look like. And in our analysis, we looked at how these different scenarios would change outcomes for access and diversity in the entry grade of pre-kindergarten or pre-K3. We looked at pre-K3 as this is the most commonly offered grade in DC schools and where we might see the largest impact because we have the most applicants in pre-K3. We looked at access to pre-K3 in terms of how match rates would change, focusing on at-risk students in the common lottery. And we looked at diversity in terms of how the percent of students who are at risk would change in pre-K. And I can go into the methodology in more detail. What we did was created a dummy applicant pool and assigned random lottery numbers 100 times and took the average rank to see whether or not students would match across different groups. Next slide, please. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'll keep going. So for the at-risk, so for our school, for what we did to construct this data set is we looked at hold on, I'm just gonna see if we can go to the next slide. We looked at the number of okay, so we looked at data that was shared with us from a subset of 12 charter schools, and these charter schools are more likely to be the ones who are would see a larger impact from this preference. They are likely to have a lower share of students who are at risk, around 15% of students at risk on average, compared to the citywide average of 45%. They're also likely to have higher wait lists than your average school. They have about 287 names on their, great, thank you. 287 names on their wait list for pre-K3 compared to a DC average of 70 names. And then in the gray box on the left, you can get a sense of our applicant pool for the school that we call Balanced PCS, Balanced Public Charter School. We had about 375 applicants in our pool. 48 of those applicants are at risk, which reflects the average percent of students who are at risk across these schools. 15 were siblings, including 2 who were also at risk. 1 was a child of staff, and 311 applicants had no preference. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So our first finding is that an at-risk priority does have the potential to increase the socioeconomic diversity at schools that serve low percentages of at-risk students. When we ran our model and our lottery for this one school, we saw that compared to the status quo of 11% of the pre-K3 class being at risk, you could see a very dramatic increase to 100% of the pre-K3 students being at risk if the at-risk preference was implemented before siblings. And this would be, and if the at-risk preference was implemented after sibling preference, the incoming pre-K3 class would be 61% at risk. And then if you reserve seats for at-risk students, the pre-K3 class would be about 31% at risk. Next slide, please. Great. So this looks in a little bit more detail at the composition of the incoming pre-K3 class, with each bar representing a different scenario. On the left, there's the status quo. And then you can see the blue parts of the bars highlight at-risk students. It's the largest if the at-risk preference is first. I'll just highlight 2 things. The first is that the green sections of the bars indicate applicants who matched without existing sibling preferences or children of staff or at-risk preference. These students only match in our model under the status quo and reserved seats. And then also the other thing I'll point out is that siblings, because of the number of open seats and the number of at-risk applicants in our model, do not match when the at-risk preference is first, but they all match in the other scenarios. Next slide, please. So our second key finding is that an at-risk preference improves the match rate substantially for individual at-risk students. In our model, about 4% of at-risk applicants matched under the status quo at this school. This increased substantially to 71% of at-risk applicants if the preference went before siblings, and even increased to 42% if the at-risk preference was implemented after siblings, and was around 19% if seats were reserved for at-risk students. This is much higher than the rigorous analysis conducted by My School DC, our common lottery organization, found that outcomes would only change for 8% of at-risk students if an at-risk preference was implemented before siblings. What we saw in our analysis is that this impact is really likely to be concentrated at a subset of schools, those that currently serve low percentages of at-risk students and have high wait lists. Next slide, please. So this looks again in more detail at match rates by different applicant group under the different scenarios. And one thing I would like to point out here is for the no preference group, which is the smaller green bars, this group has a very low likelihood of getting in under any scenario. It does decrease slightly from 6% and under the status quo to 4% under reserve seats. And you see more fluctuation for at-risk students, while the siblings and staff remain constant in most of the scenarios. Next slide, please. And this is a very simplified version of what this preference might, how these priorities might change the composition of a school over time from year 1 of implementing it with your incoming pre-K3 class to year 8 when these pre-K3 students have become 5th graders. This is very simplified and assumes constant demographics of 15% of students being at risk in other grades. But it just gives you an idea that in the first year, for example, when an at-risk preference is first before sibling preference, the overall percent of the school increases to be 26% at risk. And over time, you see increasing percentages of students who are at risk to the numbers that we see for pre-K3 in the first year. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a quick summary of the findings. Looking at these subset of public charter schools, we do see that the at-risk priority could change the socioeconomic composition of students in entry grades immediately at these schools. And it does have an individual return of increasing the match rates for individual at-risk applicants who are interested in attending these schools. And over time, it could shift the demographics of an entire school that implements the priority. Next slide. And I'll just close with some other considerations that we weren't able to look into. We weren't able to look into all of them with data, but on system-wide effects, we would be interested to think about how this priority would have ripple effects throughout the system. For example, if students who are not at risk no longer attend the schools that they used to, if they start to attend schools that used to serve higher percentages of at-risk students, those schools could have a shift in demographics as well. We also think that there could be a potential increase in applications from at-risk students if schools change their marketing or if at-risk applicants become more interested in these schools, thinking they may have a higher chance of matching. And another point on system-wide effects, we think that there could be less change in the composition of the incoming class of at-risk applicants if the same set of at-risk applicants are applying to all of the same schools. The impact of diversity at schools would be diluted, but importantly, the match rates and the ability of at-risk applicants to get a seat at schools they rank highly would be preserved. And then 2 other things I'll highlight before moving to the panel is just that we think that it's unlikely, that schools with more than 50% of students who are at risk would see a smaller impact because they're currently less likely to have a wait list. So where you fall in the line in the lottery doesn't matter as much. We also weren't able to look in this study at how this would interact with in-boundary preference for DCPS schools, but we hope to keep an eye on that for the future. So that's all from me. I would love at this point to welcome our panelists to the conversation. And we'll take a few questions. I'll ask each of them a question, and then we'll move to audience questions. So I will first introduce, we have Daniela Anello, the head of school at DC Bilingual. Ana Rodriguez, the parent of 2 daughters attending DCPS middle and high schools. She's also a PAVE, which is Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. She's a PAVE Ward 5 parent leader. And Deshaun Jones is a Ward 8 parent leader with PAVE and the proud and committed father of 4 children. So I'll start with Daniela to speak a little bit about DC Bilingual's perspective and how what you might think about how this would impact the system as a whole. So in recent years, the percentage of students who are at risk at DC Bilingual has decreased slightly, and there's a very high demand for the dual language program at DC Bilingual with over 300 applicants on the waitlist for pre-K3 this spring. Can you speak a little bit about how a potential priority for at-risk students would shift or affect the students that DC Bilingual is able to serve, and how what else needs to happen, how this might impact equity and opportunity across DC schools in general? So
yes,
yes.
Absolutely. Our school, DC Bilingual, is beautifully diverse and inclusive. The vast majority of the students that we serve are children of color. More than 40% of our students are English language learners and 15% have special needs. We have an at-risk population of 27% currently. And just as was mentioned before this, we categorize students who are at risk as students who experience homelessness, students in the foster care system, or students from families that receive food stamps or public benefits. Included in our school's vision is a charge to prepare our students for a multicultural, increasingly complex world. We know from research that diverse classrooms prepare students to succeed in a global economy. More students perform better academically in racially and socioeconomically integrated schools. And we see this happening at DC Bilingual. At DC Bilingual, at-risk students outperform at-risk students in other schools in DC in all 3 tested subjects: English, math, and science. The same is true for our special education students and our English language learners. The at-risk lottery preference is of particular interest for schools like ours. We seek to grow and maintain the ability to serve the students and families who are furthest from opportunity. For the 2020 My School DC Lottery, DC Bilingual received more than 1,900 applications. It's been our experience that while overall numbers grow, the share of at-risk families applying hasn't kept pace. As you stated in your question, our at-risk percentage has decreased from 36% to 27%. We know that if we do nothing, this beautiful balance that defines our school will not continue. And we will fail our school's commitment to our families and our community.
Thank you so much for talking about the school's perspective and how, especially in DC, where we're seeing some communities and neighborhoods change, the importance of preserving a school's mission amidst that. So just where we are on time, I'm gonna move to Ana Rodriguez and ask you a question from the parent perspective. As a resident of Ward 5 in DC with 2 daughters currently attending DCPS schools, can you speak a little bit about how you made school choices for your children and what was your experience with preferences in the common lottery in DC?
If I could just give you a past little history of what I went through. My experience is that in the beginning, when I first came to DC, I lived in Ward 8. And of course, the notion was I did not want my girls to go to school in Ward 8. Just the history of saying the schools weren't functioning. So I started the lottery process, and I ended up going to a new charter school in Ward 7. And my daughter went there. An experience wasn't a good experience. And I think it was because it was not enough diversity is what I really wanted for my daughters. So when they went to a school, they wouldn't just see, I'm Puerto Rican, they wouldn't just see little girls, Latina girls, they would see girls that are Caucasian or Indian or Asian. And so when my oldest daughter got there, she had experiences in the educational part that I felt was neglected. So by the time my daughter was in 4th grade, she visited 4 different schools in DC. A situation happened. I finally got her, I had to move. I finally got her into a school that was functioning. And at the time when I got her in that school, because of my situation with my living, I became homeless and my daughter had missed a couple days of school. so put me at risk, and I couldn't get my daughter to school on time sometimes. So because I was out of bound, they took me out the next year. What ends up happening, because of I know you heard of the McKinney veto law, they actually, because of that law, I looked at a school that was diverse, that was performing 45 minutes away from where I live. And I thought about, this is my opportunity to get in. So I went and visited the school, and they had one slot. And it wasn't through the lottery, it was because I was homeless. So I was at risk, and I was able to get my daughter, who was now a senior at Duke Ellington. At the time, she was in 4th grade. From that point, when she got into Inspired Teaching Demonstration, she changed, she flourished, she moved. And because of the sibling preference, I was able to get my other daughter in. The disparity of all of this is that I just wanted my daughters to experience a school that was diverse. But if I was to go back, I would say at-risk preferences is needed, because I wouldn't be all these years with my first child going through where she couldn't get in to the right school. I think a lot of us as parents, we tend to either move around the city. And so for me, from the time I moved to DC, I'm now in Ward 5, just so I can get the right schools for my girls. And I'm tired of moving. So, my oldest is a senior this year at Duke. And the youngest one, I put her in, she was at Inspired, but I put her in the neighborhood school. I didn't want to deal with the lottery. I just wanted a school that was diverse and that was going to give her the needs. To me, it's an injustice that you got to move around the city so you could get the right neighborhood school. So I think there needs to be at risk. I wished I was around when I was going through with my oldest daughter.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think talking about how parents and families actually experience the lottery is very helpful when we're thinking about these policies, that how this actually plays out for students and their families. So I'll move to Deshawn to ask another question from the parents' perspective, and then we'll see how we are for the audience Q&A. Deshawn, with your experience having 4 children in DC schools, what do you think an at-risk priority would meet in the common lottery that shifts demographics mean for school models? How do you think that some schools might have to adjust to serve different, more at-risk students?
Well, in my honest opinion, if an at-risk preference, well, I'm gonna first start off by saying none of my children are at risk in the true sense of educational deficiencies, any mental health disorders or disabilities. We're not on TANF or receiving any food stamps. We're not homeless, and none of my children are in foster care. So for my family in particular, if there was an at-risk preference in place, it would lessen their chance of getting into any other school, primarily because it would identify the children who were at risk and who would satisfy that preference, and just taking into account at-risk preference being first and pushing everything else to the side. Just for example, my children are now will be attending check, and because they're attending check, they got in from the sibling preference. But to just go into it just a little bit more, regardless of whether they have an at-risk preference or not, the biggest thing is making sure that you finance the schools, all of the schools, because with an at-risk preference at any one of the schools and any one of the 8 wards, every school is going to need to be fully funded, and each and every one of the staff members are going to have the training necessary to accommodate the influx of increased students who are at risk on every level. So I'm going to say that off the top, that's definitely what's needed.
I think that's critical to think about what's needed at schools, particularly schools that might be shifting the profile of students whom they serve. And it's also important to consider how different student groups will be impacted by this at-risk preference. And there are some ongoing conversations in DC about what it should mean, or what the definition of at-risk for funding, and how some students aren't captured. And I think that's incredibly important, especially this year with the new challenges that are ongoing with distance learning so I think we will do one more question for the panelists, and I'll just if people want to answer this, feel free, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. The council is considering a priority for at-risk students in the common lottery. Do you have any suggestions for what other policies would be necessary to implement this fully, to make it to have the most increase in and diversity at certain schools? Now, does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Just my opinion. I think it would benefit, especially with the early learning. My daughter's school predominantly was 85% Caucasian. And because of sibling preference, my daughter was able to get in. But imagine if I was a homeless, or if I was at risk, or my child had disability, and I lived wherever I lived at, it shouldn't matter. But I couldn't get my daughter in that school because of the lottery. I think it's fair across board to allow others to get opportunities to be able to get into school. Sometimes some parents don't go to the school to visit at open house. So their voice is basically their lottery. Culture differences. So, being a Spanish speaker, tend to not want to go to open house unless we know that there's others that speak Spanish. So even in my own daughter's school, I've reached out to try to get, the Latino community to come to the school and to do lottery or whatever. But I feel like the at-risk is very important, especially for kids of color. Yes, my kids are not at risk right now. Yes, my daughters are flooring. Yes, I live in a great neighborhood, but I remember being there. And so I think it's a need.
Well, I guess if I have to say anything, education is very important. Our city has put a premium on education with COVID-19 coming into play, transitioning to distant learning. And I'm going to honestly say it was presented really poorly in a number of other schools. However, there were some schools that actually did really, really well. So with education being a priority and of great importance right now, we definitely need to know and understand how is it that we can meet the needs of all of our students, the students who are at risk, the students who are impoverished. Chelsea, you said the social economic diversity is low within schools without an at-risk preference, and the number one thing that I'm really focused on right now with what we're dealing with is how we're going to educate our children, how we're going to make sure that part testing with career and college readiness, they will be proficient. I don't want to get on that, but proficient is just the word. And every school has their own different types of numbers to identify proficiency. And if we still talk about how at risk is for a child being a year behind or more, I mean, we're already talking about Ward 7 and Ward 8 having an education gap and an income gap of almost 80%. I mean, as far as education and income total, I mean, there's no way that we compare with Ward 3 and Ward 2, where a lot of our schools are 4-star schools and 5-star schools. So what exactly are they doing? Is it just the population? Is it because they have access to resources, or is it because there's special attention paid to those schools to keep them premium and high profile schools because the parents put a lot more work into it? I mean, the diversity, the equity, and the inclusion needs to be all over the city. Everybody needs to be the exact same quality education in any school, wherever you go, wherever you live, and know that the teachers are well equipped and prepared to handle whatever student population comes their way, so that they can know that they have a very safe environment for them to come to and learn and be successful at learning. And the data clearly shows that if you have a learning environment that's loving and that's caring, those children tend to learn at a higher rate.
And if I can just add on to that, I couldn't be in more agreement with that statement. And I just have to be, we have to be very clear. There's an unmet demand for high quality school programming for students all over the city, specifically those that are at risk. Our school in particular has seen that, you know, we are having success with students who are at-risk students. And this is incredibly important to us right now because we have one of the highest wait list numbers in all of the city, and we're looking to grow the school. So right now, we are looking to close to double the size of our school to be able to serve more students. And of the students we really want to welcome, we really want to serve, are those that we know our school knows how to serve well, and that the city has an unmet demand to serve well. So this is incredibly important to schools like mine that really need support with giving access to the families that need the best, highest quality education and who can otherwise not be providing their families and students with a great school.
Thank you so much for those additional thoughts, especially around increasing access for at-risk students during this time. At this point, we'll shift to audience question and answers. I will be here to answer questions. So will Hallie and Deshawn, Anna, and Daniela. I will introduce Michelle Burris, who is a senior policy associate at the Century Foundation, who will take questions on video. Tanaz Meghjani of the DC Policy Center will be typing answers in the chat in the Q&A. So look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So our first question is, what, if anything, is DC doing to improve those schools where there is a lower desire to attend? Based on the data, it looks as though they have a higher percentage of at-risk students.
So I can take a first attempt, or unless anyone else has thoughts. Go ahead, Deshawn.
Well, so mental health support and trauma-informed care is what I'm really big on. And one of the major factors that our student population deals with in a lot of the low enrollment, high-risk schools, which generally circulate more in Ward 7 and Ward 8, is trying to make sure that you actually provide those schools, those students with access to resources, the services that they need so that they can definitely be addressed. I'll be the first to tell you, I grew up in Ward 8 with the school in Ward 8, native Washingtonian, graduated from DC, and I would love for my children to continue to go to school in Ward 8. Am I afraid of Ward 8? No, I'm not, because I'm going to be at the school fighting every day for my children to get exactly what they need. However, the money and the resources need to be put into each and every school to make sure that social emotional learning is focused on. We get high quality programs into the schools to introduce the students to something new and different than what it is that they're already exposed to, and also making sure that the culture of the school and each and every staff member in the school is well versed enough in being able to handle the students, to provide them with the proper conversation so that they won't feel outcast or set aside, so that they will want to talk to the staff and the administration, and they'll want to come to school and they'll want to learn, except for or other than just coming to school to get a free meal or just to get out the house, because they facing a crisis every day and they already know how to deal with it. However, they've also learned how to put that exact same crisis in any and every other place where they go. Our schools need to know how to deal with the staff, need to deal with the students, provide them with the proper resources that they need, and DC needs to make sure that they put that money into the schools and don't cut any money for education, especially in times like this. We need it.
Thank you, Deshaun. Our next question is, given the schools used in creating the composite, are there other structural barriers that might limit at-risk applicants, such as distance from public transit?
I can speak to this. I think that's definitely a concern. When we looked at the 12 public charter schools, they tend to be located in wards 4 and 5, which can be far away from where a lot of at-risk students in DC live. And even in a normal year, getting using public transit to go across the city can be a challenge, especially for our youngest learners. And even more so in the coming year, if and when we do return to in-person. So yeah, I think definitely distance from these programs can be a challenge for some students.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what would be the difference in the impact on socioeconomic diversity if all schools implemented the at-risk preference versus a voluntary preference?
I can speak a little bit to this, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, I think if all schools implemented it, you would see more shifts at schools that currently serve the lowest percentages of at-risk students. And I don't think you would see much change, although a little bit of change at schools that serve high percentages of at-risk students, because again, they don't have, those schools tend not to have as high wait lists currently. I think what this question may be asking is, amongst the schools that currently serve low percentages of at-risk students, if some choose to offer this preference and others don't, will those who don't kind of have an exaggerated impact and have much fewer at-risk students? And I think it's hard to know. I would say that the schools that don't under this may continue in the status quo, kind of continuing to serve around 15% of students who are at risk, and these other schools may shift, but I'm not sure.
Great, thank you. The next question, given that the at-risk indicator misses students from families who have low incomes but are unable to take up public benefits, such as students who are from unauthorized immigrant families, could this preference end up disadvantaging some students it seeks to support?
I don't know, Danielle, we've talked about this. If you want to speak, or I can.
You can start and I will add on.
I think this is a valid point, especially in recent years where it's become more of a challenge there's more fear around getting certain benefits, and some students who in previous years may have been identified as being at risk are no longer identified. And that's definitely a real concern. I know there are some conversations around changing the definition for at risk and being a little bit more creative in coming years. Danielle, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that the right now, just the political atmosphere tends to be one where families are afraid of asking for government assistance in many cases. And in our particular school, we have many undocumented families, and they currently have felt less likely to request government supports, only because they worry that would, tag them to then become easily identified as people that should be deported from the country. And so we have had to provide lots of services and supports to our families and know your rights type of educational workshops to ensure that people who need the supports are getting the supports, and that doesn't then lead to them possibly going through something incredibly traumatic for the family.
Thank you. The next question is, do we see an at-risk preference being mandatory across all schools?
I know from the proposed legislation, it's something that schools can opt into. and decide how they would like to implement it at this point, whether kind of thinking about 3 ways to do it, whether it would be before siblings and children of staff, or after, or in some reserving some percentage of seats for students who are at risk. And DCPS is piloting this approach of reserving seats at Stevens Early Learning this coming fall. And I believe reserved about 40% of seats for at-risk applicants in pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. So.
And I would just add on that the schools need to have it in their mission and in their practice to know how to serve at-risk students and how to serve them well. I think it would be a really it wouldn't be advantageous at all for schools who have no experience or knowledge on how to support the families who are at risk, and then provide preference over other students without the capacity building and knowledge building to make sure that they know how to do that really well. So I think, yes, I think schools have to select their preference, but I do believe that if that is a preference that is selected, there does have to be a level of understanding and education for all of the staff at the school in order to do that work really well.
Great, thank you.
If I could chime in just for 1 half second. We want to increase the at-risk preference, or the idea to increase the at-risk preference to a small number, like 0.3%, which would give each and every student $4,062. Now, with the at-risk preference being where it is now at 0.225, that gives each and every student $2,437. Now, don't get me wrong, that sounds like good money. However, it's about how you use that money. It's about the school actually taking those funds and putting it into the proper training and the proper learning tools for the students to be able to learn as effectively and as efficiently as having that money come to the school and being used for those students. So if we can raise the at-risk weight, get more money into the schools, we better equip the schools with more financial stability to work with those students, and we would hope that that money is used appropriately and you get a better outcome with the students who are at risk going to these different schools.
Great, thank you. The next question is, will increasing the percentage of at-risk students in schools change the rigor of the educational environment that already exists? And as a follow-up, will there be any additional social and emotional services that are provided to support the number of at-risk students?
Daniela, do you want to?
Yes. So this question pulls a little bit at my heartstrings because it assumes that children who are at risk are also underperforming. That's not necessarily the case. I think that there are different services and different needs that all of the children have. And there are kids who are middle class and come from middle class socioeconomic status, and they're 2 or 3 years behind as well. So I think that there's it's all data based, and at schools we look at each child individually, and we look at where they are in their growth measures for all of the areas, including socio-emotional measures. And so the rigor shouldn't change anything about the school's practices, because we again teach students at where they are, independent of everyone else. And we group them based on data, and we educate them based on where they need to go next. And we track growth in that way for all students alike. So if anything, schools become more diverse, beautiful, rich, well-rounded, and just much more welcoming of all of the kids that, you know, should be learning from one another and experiencing things that make them feel really proud of who they are and what makes them unique and a valued member of the school and a valued citizen of the world that can have, you know, independent thoughts and have and make change happen for the better in our nation. So I would say it's going to enhance the quality of education rather than decrease the quality of education if we allow more children to be mixed with one another at schools.
Thank you, Daniela. The next question is, do you think that COVID will impact how far a parent is willing to get their child to go to a better school?
Thanks, Michelle. Anna, I don't know if you want to talk about this a little bit, give you a chance to jump in.
Well, for me, because of COVID, I have 2 girls who wouldn't even go outside, let alone. And my whole thing, literally, for going forward, I'm looking for online. You still do preference, you still do lottery to make sure you know it's the right program. The disadvantage of COVID is that if you're not in the right school, is it going to be the right program for your child? So it's not even talking about the diversity, because they're not going to see no one unless they're on a class where they see other classmates. So it's a little different. But for me, I'm more of, I had this idea, like if we really ran a program that was across the board for every school to follow, and it was fair across the board, and every school had online training just, you know, for COVID time until we go back into our respective schools. I just think that the less travel is better. I think you should be able to go to school in the neighborhood you live. That's why my daughter goes to a neighborhood school. Because if they told me she had to come in there one day out of the week, I can walk her or drive her over there and then go back and get her. With COVID traveling, to me, I just think it's unsafe. That's just my opinion.
Is it possible I can chime in on that?
Please.
So my older 3 kids will be attending Czech this coming school year, and one sibling preference actually helped with getting them in. I originally chose Friendship Tech on Martin Luther King Avenue. I shared custody with their mom, so I wanted to find a medium ground that would be very, very beneficial for her and for myself. However, because my oldest daughter did very, very well at Czech, mainly because with COVID-19 hitting, Czech was already on board with Summit and Canvas, with having their assignments online. And when they incorporated the regular routine of Zoom calls to maintain the integrity of the classroom, my daughter, she continued to do well. So I'm really proud of my choice with my children going to Czech, especially with COVID-19 being of a great issue, and we won't hear anything from the board until the 31st of July on what their transition will be for school. I'm confident that with how Czech managed distant learning, I am very, very confident that whether they have to travel to school once a week, twice a week, they'll still get the proper resources at home and the schooling and education that they need because of the example that they provided in the distant learning for the 3 months that the schools have closed.
Thank you, Deshaun. We have time for about one more question. Our last question is, are there any recommendations around how the district could or should consider using information nudges to influence preferences? For example, what has been tried or could be tried the way to use information about how good a school is within communities?
Danielle, I don't know if you want to speak. I think this would be definitely something that interesting to explore. And I know that some schools do targeted marketing in neighborhoods to influence, to increase demand for their schools. And I think it would be interesting to see how this would interact with an at-risk preference if schools start to recruit different students.
Yes. So at DC Bilingual, we launched an intentional student recruitment plan. But the recruitment plan can only do so much. We have, for example, gone to every recruitment fair that's been in the wards that we know have the majority of at-risk students. We have called all of the families who applied and just reminded them why we think the school is a good fit for their child in case any of the preference rankings could change the outcome of the matching process. We have partnered with school organizations that help to inform families of the options for high quality schools. And we even do leafleting. We are in Ward 5, but we're right across the street from Ward 4. And the majority of our students do reside in Ward 4 and Ward 5, but still we need to just raise awareness of who we are and what we do. But I think we're really in a bind here, because without the preference for us in particular, we can't do much more than just raising awareness about who we are, what we do, and why we think this school would be great for at-risk families. However, and when they apply, it's very frustrating if we've done all of this, cheerleading them on into considering our school, and then they receive a 300th wait list number for their child to get in. It's just, we're not really working that efficiently here with that process. So I think the preference is the best way we can solve for this. And I think that raising awareness about, why this matters, why it matters now, being able to tell that story and move people to pay attention, I think is the best thing we can do at this time.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. And now I'm handing it back to Chelsea.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you again so much to everyone for joining us. I'll just have a little bit of closing. As we've talked about today, and as you may know, we could see an at-risk preference more broadly in DC schools in the coming year. DC Council is having a hearing on an optional at-risk priority next Friday for public charter schools, and DCPS is implementing this preference for the first time at Stevens Early Learning Center this fall. If this broader preference for public charter schools moves forward, DC would be joining cities like Denver, Charlotte, and New York City, who offer preferences to students who are economically disadvantaged in some form or another. I really appreciated hearing from Daniela today on what this might mean for a particular school in DC, and from Deshawn and Anna on how this might impact a parent's journey through school choice in DC and students. And just as two updates from the DC Policy Center, we'll be following up on this study in two ways. Next week, we will be releasing an update on our Landscape of Diversity School Report to look at how diversity at some schools has changed over the last 2 years. And we are also taking a closer look at application patterns for at-risk students and where at-risk students tend to apply for this fall. So again, thank you for attending today, and a special thank you to our panelists, to Deshawn, Danielle, and Anna, for taking time out of your day to join us and share your perspectives. A recording of this will be made available on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, immediately following the event, if you'd like to share with anyone. For more information on upcoming events and our work, please visit tcf.org and dcpolicycenter.org. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.